This little video is a presentation of a paper that Katja Malinova and I recently wrote on tokenomics, on the question of when blockchain tokens can beat equity. Now, tokens have electrified markets over the last 2 years. As you can see here, the total number of ICOs over the last, since January 2016, has been over 1,000. They've collected over 25 billion or the equivalent of 25 billion in funding, which is is a very large number. At the same time, if we try to look at this in relation to existing markets, let's take the Canadian TSX. The TSX itself has a market capitalization of 2.2 trillion, which is, of course, orders of magnitude larger than the token market. At the same time, if you think of, say, the Toronto Venture Exchange, which is a market for early stage firms, and many of these ICO firms are small firms that have just started or are about to be started, that basically fall into that category. And the Toronto Venture market only has a market capitalization of 41 billion accumulated over roughly 20 years. So by all reasonable standards, the token market is not large compared to existing equity markets, but it is very large compared to comparable early stage firms markets. Now, the problem with this market is, in particular with tokens, is that there is really a lack of understanding what actually makes a token. Now, here's a Dilbert comic on this one. As you can see, the boss tries to ask what a token is, and he has absolutely no clue. And in some sense, this, I think, describes actually what people and how people think about tokens. They don't understand the functionality. They don't really understand what it is. And that makes the discussion really quite difficult. Now, if you look at the state of the debate at this current stage, what is that people talk about? Well, first, there's a bubble, right? So, of course, we know by now the crypto markets have declined dramatically. Collapse is another word that you could use for that. They've been crashed, essentially has crashed by now. There are numerous scams. There was one estimate that 85% of all announced ICOs were in fact scams. And now, to the market's credit, or to the systems or ecosystems credit, many of these never made it to market. But the big question is, also of whether or not these tokens are securities. And the SEC recently went out on a crackdown on a number of these token providers. They also went after the coders for decentralized exchanges. And they show basically and exerted their power there. But what is kind of missing from this debate is really, I think, a very critical and important question, which is there actually any economic merit to issuing these tokens? Or is the only reason why we see them regulatory arbitrage and maybe a way to save and go around the existing legacy system, where it is very expensive to issue securities? If you want to do an IPO, this usually costs you several $1 million just to get it going, legal costs, underwriter costs that you have to pay to brokers, and so on and so forth. So really the question is, do tokens solve an economic problem? And that is what we're trying to tackle here in this paper. And the results that we found actually did surprise us a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe very, very briefly a model of ICOs, just so that we can have a way to understand how this works. And what we're taking here really is we're taking ingredients from the standard toolset of corporate finance. And if you want IO, and just try to get a very, very simple model in order to understand what a token does economically and whether or not it is intrinsically superior or inferior to equity. Now, the entrepreneur here in our model wants to produce a good or service. The assumption is that he will be a monopolist once he has produced a service, which is what most entrepreneurs that have no idea want to be. There's a setup cost for the production, which is C0. There is a marginal cost of producing a unit of output with little c, and the demand that we have is uncertain. Now, here we just assume a linear demand because, as I said, we want to keep it as simple as possible, which makes it, in my opinion, as transparent as possible. Here we're plotting the inverse demand function. So usually the higher the price, the lower the demand. Same for the inverse demand. And we assume that this demand function is uncertain before production begins. So in particular, the way we model this here is just that the intercept of this linear demand function is unknown. It could be high or low. Right, so now what does the entrepreneur do? Well, the entrepreneur wants to maximize its profits, which is just revenue minus costs. And as you can see, this basically leads us to finding the intersection point where the marginal revenue equals and coincides with the marginal cost. Here, this is the benchmark is just this intercept number minus marginal cost divided by 2. So this is the profit maximizing output. This is what a monopolist entrepreneur would produce at if they have the funding for the sunk cost of C0, so for setting up the production. Now, the next question is, what do we do with equity? So I'll keep the plots as they are. If you have an entrepreneur and the entrepreneur provides equity or finances the project with equity to raise the sunk cost of C0, what does he have to do? Well, the way we do this in this model is we assume that the investors fund the project as long as they break even. If you want, you can build in, of course, a required rate of return, which is not just break even. You need to have a required rate which is larger. That can be built in. It's not really a problem. It just complicates the math. So it's not really something you want to do here. All right. So in this case, what happens is the entrepreneur maximizes his share of the revenue, and as you can see, this is essentially the same maximization problem. So the production that the entrepreneur under these circumstances would pick is essentially the same as he would be if he would have his own fund. This is a standard result from corporate finance. There's no magic here. So this gives us a benchmark though, right? So under equity financing, the entrepreneur would finance the project, the financiers would finance the project, and he would produce the profit maximizing quantity. Now let's move on to ICO financing. Now, what is really an ICO? Well, there's a colleague of mine, Joshua Ganz and Christian Catalini. They wrote an extremely insightful paper where they basically say, look, what an ICO is essentially that you sell future output. The way they describe it in their model is there's a particular approach, but in our view, there's actually two ways how you can do a token sale. Now, one is the one that Christian and Josh, the way they modeled it, and there's another paper which we cite in our paper, which has the same approach, is where you essentially sell a fraction of the future revenue. And in our paper, we refer to this as revenue sharing. So the way it works is you produce a number of tokens, and then you sell a fraction of those. And then once you produce a particular quantity Q, the price will be set at the number of tokens divided by the quantity. Now, there's another way of how you can actually do a token financing, and that is closer to how crowdfunding works. And what you do there is you basically sell units of output, right? So this is an output pre-sale. What you do there is formally you sell a number of tokens, and then once you understand what the demand is, you pick the quantity that you produce, and the entrepreneur gets to keep the revenue of the tokens that he has not sold to token holders. Now, this is essentially you can think about this as somebody, for instance, producing quadcopters. So they pre-sell the quadcopters. Now, there's a difference because quadcopters, nobody, if you buy a quadcopter, so most Kickstarter project is that people just want to have the project or the output of the project directly. They don't buy it in order for pre-sale. And this is a substantial difference, of course, to tokens, where token holders are bought by investors. So how does this work in the math? Right? So we're revenue sharing. What happens is that the entrepreneur has to pick a share of the revenue and maximizes the share of maximize the quantity relative to the share of the revenue that he would receive from the tokens. This is different from equity because in equity, what you share is the future profits. So now what that essentially means is that the marginal demand curve is slightly smaller. It doesn't quite shift to the left, but it moves to the left. And what that implies is that when you maximize your problem is, well, you actually maximize at the point where you produce a quantity that is lower than the optimal quantity. So you receive here is underproduction. All right, now how does the output pre-sale work? Well, an output pre-sale is the entrepreneur issues a number of tokens, then he chooses the quantity that solves the maximization problem, where in this particular case he maximizes the quantity based on the inverse demand function, which then takes into account that T token have already been issued. What that implies essentially is that the marginal revenue function that you're optimizing against moves to the right. And so what you then do is you pick a point which leads to overproduction. So you issue too many tokens. Now, the economic intuition is that the entrepreneur does not internalize the extra output unit and how it affects the revenue or the profits or whatever, the income of the token holders. So this looks pretty bad, right? If you think about it, right? So one leads to overproduction, right? So revenue share leads to overproduction. The output presale, to underproduction. Output presale leads to overproduction. But none of that looks good. Well, so can we solve this problem? Well, the answer is, of course, yes. And how? Well, we just combine the two. So when we say just, there has to be a clever way to combine it. But really, the idea is as follows, right? So when we think of the overproduction problem, the issue is that the entrepreneur does not internalize the cost that he imposes on the other token holders. So how do we solve in economics usually such an externality problem? Well, we do a tax. And here the tax would be on the future token issuances. So every time the entrepreneur issues a future token, which imposes the externality, he has to pay some of this back to the original shareholders. And if you do this in a clever way, we can arrange it such that the marginal revenue function intersects exactly with the marginal cost at precisely the same point, which is the optimizing point. And in our model, we can show that this is indeed the case. So formally, so the way you do it, you issue a number of tokens ex ante, you then share a fraction of this revenue. The entrepreneur solves a maximization problem, which is exactly the combination of the revenue from tokens and the revenue from the pre-sale. And then in the terms of the solution that he gets, you basically pick exactly the same production points as you would under optimization. And we can even determine what the optimal token share is that you have to, what fraction of profits you have to share in the future. So in other words, token financing is not inferior here. We can do this optimally. Basically the contract is if the produced quantity is larger than the number of tokens that you've picked earlier, then you share any revenue thereafter. If it's smaller, then you redeem them at a particular rate, and the token holders will receive some form of refund. What you show then is the entrepreneur produces the optimal quantity, which is the same as the monopoly quantity, and the entrepreneur receives the full net present value of the project. So in other words, the surplus that is created here is exactly the same as in the monopoly case. Now, what happens if you do the moral hazard? So now the next question that we want to ask, and so this is, there we have equivalence of token financing and equity financing. We thought that's a pretty cool result, but then we decided to push it a little further. And we looked at a simple problem that is very prevalent and something that we commonly study in corporate finance, and that is that of moral hazard. So the idea here is that the entrepreneur, through his own actions, can influence future demand. Now, in order to do that, the person has to put in some effort, and that effort comes at a cost. If he does it, then the way we model is that the demand function is on average has a higher possible expected intercept. If you don't put in the effort, then everything just stays at a particular benchmark. So now the assumption that we're making here is that the net present value of the project is such that only when you put in the effort on expectation is there a positive net present value. If you don't put in the effort, on average, you lose money. So this is, as I said, this is a very common problem that we study in corporate finance. You find it in every textbook. And we believe it's actually quite relevant particularly for most of the entities that issue ICOs, because they work in a decentralized world where the developers are scattered around the globe. Sometimes it's not even such a thing as an entrepreneur. But you can also think that this can be quite applicable for existing firms that may want to finance a particularly different type of enterprise within the existing firm, and they want to raise funding for that. And regular shareholders may not be quite happy to, say if you're a rubber boot producer, they may not want you to fund the production of mobile phones. Go figure. If you don't know what that is, check the history of firms. All right. Now, so let's think about this. How would this work with equity financing? The equity holders, the way we model it is as follows. If the entrepreneur puts in the effort, they can possibly break even. If the entrepreneur does not put in effort, they cannot break even. So, if they know that the entrepreneur is not willing to put in the effort, they will not want to finance this endeavor. So how about the entrepreneur? Well, if he does put in the effort, then he receives a share of the revenue, actually the share of the profits under equity financing. which comes from the beta distribution, but he has to pay the cost of effort. If he does not put in the effort, then he earns a share of the revenue from the lower distribution. So now, how does this add up? Well, you can essentially ask the question of under what circumstances is it better to put in the effort, and there is a mathematical equation here which we can just describe by the net present value in the high state. I'm going to come back to this equation later. For now, just take this as a bunch of math. Now, if we finance tokens with, if we finance the project with tokens, the problem for the token holders essentially is the same as for equity holders. They only want to finance it if the entrepreneur puts in the effort. Now, how does the entrepreneur's problem look like? Well, if he puts in the effort under the optimal contract that we've designed before, he receives the incremental token revenue in the high state, but he has to put in the cost of effort, and otherwise, if he doesn't put in the effort, he receives the incremental revenue from the token sales under the low distribution. So again, the question is, under what circumstances is it better to put in the effort? And here is the equation. Now, if you look at this equation with a hard eye, you can see that it almost looks like the same condition that we have for equity, with the exception of these last two terms that are now cycled in red. Now, the big insight is, if you look at this formally, and this is a very simple algebraic result, is that the key math insight is that the constraint for equity is stricter than the constraint for tokens. In other words, with moral hazard, all projects that can be financed by equity, so whenever the condition is satisfied for equity, it is also satisfied for tokens. But there are some projects that can be financed with the optimal token contract that cannot be financed with an equity contract. So in other words, tokens with entrepreneurial moral hazard are superior to equity. Now, this is a result which both of these results that we had surprised us. So what is it that we did in summary? We took a simple model of ICOs and tried to compare ICO token financing to equity financing. All that we did is we took ingredients from the standard corporate finance toolbox. We find that without frictions, we can design an optimal token contract in such a manner that it finances exactly the same projects as with equity. And this contract involves the usage of both token presale and a share of future revenues. So if you want a tax on the entrepreneur for any future sales that he does. So in doing so, we can get exactly the same outcome as with equity. And if there's moral hazard, in fact, it is the case that token financing is superior to equity financing. Now, the last thing I want to briefly state is that the trick here is, and the insight from token financing is not actually that new. In fact, it goes back to the original idea of Jensen Meckling from the 1970s, because token has a certain feature of debt financing, right? So because essentially the token finance, or the entrepreneur under token financing, receives payments only if he works hard, if he puts in the effort. And that's similar to when you have debt, right? So because you have to pay debt back first, debt is senior to equity. And therefore, debt actually has an effect of enticing managers to do the work. And if you want an entire business model, the entire business model of leveraged buyouts, in fact, is based on that idea. It's that debt tightens the company and makes the entrepreneur work harder. And in some sense, tokens can accomplish exactly the same thing. Now, the last thing I have, of course, to say here is that most of these entities, small startup firms, have no access to debt whatsoever. Nobody's going to give them a credit, a loan, right? So we don't have to talk about that. But with tokens, essentially, you can mimic debt without actually issuing debt. So, in other words, there is economic and conceptual merit to the idea of token financing. And so we hope that this is a useful contribution to the debate, because we are a little discouraged by the fact that tokens as a whole are so wholeheartedly dismissed by the regular financial industry, when, as we try to argue here, there's actually merit to having them. This is something that could lead to firms being financed that would not be financeable with standard funds. Right, this is all I have. Here's some contact information from me if you're interested. Thank you for listening.